turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens. Kim's
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the
Okay, I'm Hobe Hays, and I was born here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I lived here most of my life up until my wife and I went to New York in 1962. I went to university here at the University of Nebraska, played on the Nebraska baseball team. We had 2 Big 7 championship teams in 1948 and 1950. We went to New York in '62. I freelanced. My wife freelanced in acting, and I freelanced in commercial art, illustration. I had several painting shows and did some book illustration, wrote a book called The Adventure. And then I joined a college in Long Island and stayed there for about 25 years. And my wife was at another college in Suffolk County. I was in Nassau County. Then I retired in 1995 and came back here because we have family and I wanted to be here with them. This book, the one I'm talking about tonight, that was written after I came back, was developed when I went down to the Historical Society and began looking up old games in the newspapers and in the files, Nebraska games, and then I began looking up the games in the Nebraska Independent League. And I got so interested in the box scores and how many hits I got and so forth, and then I began reading some of my old columns. And in those columns I had a lot of stories and details which suddenly gave me a flood of memories, and I said, there's a book here, I've got to write about this, you know. And I got some encouragement, and we began the book. Well, I love to read about the 2 home runs I hit off of Art Dollahan in a pennant race game. The downside of that was that after I hit the first 2 times up I hit a home run, and this was a very big game. This pitcher was the strikeout king of the league. People weren't supposed to hit home runs off of him, let alone me. I was not necessarily a long ball hitter. The 3rd time I came up, he threw one right at my head and I went down. I got up, threw another one at my head. I wound up taking 3 in a row right at my head, and one of them hit the bill of my cap. I heard it. And then the next time up, he did the same thing. So I had been knocked down a total of 6 times, and I had 2 home runs. I'd knocked in 4 of the runs for our team. I had practically won the game single-handedly, and yet it was one of the most disturbing experiences that I ever went through. I always liked to write, even in high school. When I played semi-pro ball in McCook, Nebraska, I worked as a sports reporter at the McCook Daily Gazette, and they gave me a twice-a-week column on sports to write about the baseball team that was in the league I was playing in. So that was absolutely perfect for me. I got good experience writing. I had a great time. I played in the ball games, and then I would write up what happened. And whenever I had a real good day, I had to be very careful. But it was a wonderful experience, and I like to write as long as I can remember, almost as much as I like to do artwork. When I was a college student and high school, I liked Damon Runyon, you know. And I liked Red Smith as a sports writer. I read William Saroyan a lot. Artists, I was much of a realist when I was in college painting, and I liked people like Rembrandt and Daumier and Degas and Lautrec and people like that. And then later on I got into non-objective art and painted a number of abstractions and non-objective works. but I started out very realistic. In fact, one time I had a class in the Chicago Art Institute, and my instructor, Philbrick, he said, "You have a photographic eye, don't you?" And I didn't ever think of it that way, but I was a real copier, you know. I do things as I saw them, at least the way I thought they were, you know. And he said, loosen up a little bit, you know, get some expression in there. You got a photographic eye. And this was not meant as a compliment, you know. It's like, you're an artist. You don't have to draw it exactly as you see it, you know, to put some individual expression into it. Oh, there are some people that say this, I don't know about anybody else, they say, but this book meant so much to me because my dad was talking about playing ball or my uncle or my brother, and they talk about the players that they knew and associations, and it just, my first book signing at Lee Booksellers, I had a line 100 feet across the store, and people were coming in there to see me that I hadn't seen since I was in junior high. And some of them had to tell me who they were, you know. It's been received by certain people with great warmth and great affection, and it means a lot to them. Not just the people who knew players in the league that I played in, but you see there are other leagues around, the Lincoln Pioneer Night League and Cornhusker League, and it's so similar in the whole act of semi-pro ball was. Everybody was into it, but yes, it's been received very well. Yeah, I'm working on one right now. I'm in the middle of it. It's going to be called something like "Come a-Runnin' Boys." Now that's the first line of a song that used to be the school song. You know, it was. I'm not sure just what the name of it is. I've got it written down somewhere. But my dad took me to a football game when I was about 10, and they played that song, and everybody stood up. And I said, "Why are they all standing?" And he said, "This is the school song." And I said, "I thought there is no place like Nebraska," or something was. And he said, this is kind of like the school anthem, you know. And so there was almost the religious experience. The tears were in their eyes as they sang the song, you know. So I wanted to call this book "Come a-Runnin' Boys," Nebraska Sports Experiences Before, or Husker Memories Before AstroTurf, Skyboxes, aluminum bats, or something like that, you know. In other words, early, my experiences, my memories, not something from the files, you know, things that I saw and experienced. And I saw a number of very eventful things, like I saw Jesse Owens get beat by a guy in the tryouts for the 1936 Olympics. So things like that. And then, you know, the book I wanted to be memories, my memories of these great experiences. Let's go back through time 51 years to a summer night in McCook, Nebraska. Population 8,000. The sky is dark on this warm, still night, except for a glow at the eastern edge of town. Above Eastside Ballpark, large round floodlights on tall wooden poles illuminate the playing field. Behind the chalk-lined and freshly smoothed dirt infield, rich green grass stretches to the outfield fence. As a few spectators begin to file into the bleachers, the groundskeeper fastens the bases down. The baseball players arrive in their cars, and they walk across the gravel parking lot in crunching, crackling sounds, a few carrying heavy canvas bags of wooden bats and horsehide baseballs. It is opening night for the McCook Cats, semi-pro baseball team, member of the Nebraska Independent League. In 1948, in McCook, there was nothing to compare with it in total town focus and excitement. My story begins in McCook at the Burlington Station, where shortstop Bob Grogan and I stepped off the 419 train one June morning in 1948. McCook had already signed Bob, even though our Big 7 championship season at the University of Nebraska wasn't finished. I'd come along as Bob's second base partner from Nebraska to try out for that position at McCook. We didn't realize we were hired guns brought in to lead a 2-year last place team to a startling league championship. Since before the Depression and on into the post-war 1940s, town baseball had been the #1 sporting interest, and to many, gambling interest, of all small Midwestern communities. Rivalries were intense and long established, and if you were standing in just the right places, you could see large sums of money passing hands behind the bleachers in years not stricken with grasshopper plagues and droughts. The years after World War II became the golden age of Nebraska semi-pro baseball. Many players returned with valuable baseball experience on strong service teams, and all came home with a hunger to play baseball again in a peacetime setting. The 3 best semi-pro leagues in Nebraska right after the war were generally agreed to be the Nebraska Independent League, or NIL, the Pioneer Night League, and the Cornhusker League. The NIL would become the most freewheeling, notorious, expensive, and, in the opinion of many, the best of the 3. The very factors that gave it this distinction would also hurry its inevitable destruction. The 1947-48 season was an NIL turning point. The McCook situation had become intolerable to the town merchants and nearby farmers and cattlemen who had suffered regular losses in the betting transactions and were having to pass up the tempting odds offered by gloating high rollers from out of town. The crisis desperately called for imagination and sacrifice. So Doc Dennis, the best dentist in town, sat down with Pat Patrick in Pat's shoe store to plot some emergency action. They formed the McCook Baseball Board. The plan was simply to raise enough money to hire the kind of team that couldn't lose very often. And then Doc, Pat, Big Bill Hankey, and the old boys in new blue overalls who came in from the big cattle ranches and rich croplands could all get well at last. However, my first semi-pro baseball experience came from none of the 3 leagues just mentioned. It was with an independent team here in Lincoln in 1946 and 1947 named Sandy's. An enterprising ex-second baseman from Cuba, Sandy Silveria, who had a Getz beer franchise in Lincoln, put together the best players in town and played small neighboring teams and big famous traveling teams like the Kansas City Monarchs. Heading up Sandy's pitching staff was Smokey Molden, a tall black pitcher with such blazing speed that many believed he could and would have pitched for the Monarchs had he not made more money pitching, freelancing out of Lincoln. I want to point out a couple of players here. It's my brother Don, and there I am, Bob Grogan, Bill Kinnaman, our catcher, and Bill Jennings. Now, Bill Kinnaman went on to umpire in the American League in the 60s. When I was in New York, I used to watch the Yankees play, and Bill was umpiring behind the plate. Bill Jennings was an NFL referee, and there was another player in the league, his name escapes me right now, but he also became an NFL referee. Sandy is over there at the far right on the front row. This was the first semi-pro team I played with, and Smokey's not in that picture. This was what Smokey looked like when he stood out there on the mound. Blazing fastball. Smokey and Max Quick, who pitched for Stromsburg and many other teams, were the 2 most sought-after pitchers in the state of Nebraska during that time. The NIL towns were located about midway between Lincoln and Denver, whose teams in the Class A Western League offered the closest possibilities for southwestern Nebraska people to see good professional baseball. Since either city represented a trip of more than 200 miles for most, the NIL merged as a near satisfying substitute. In those days, McCook was a town that saw a lot of rocking and resting going on among the older folks on hot summer afternoons. Most of the younger people had gone to other places for summer job or college opportunities. There were few exciting or controversial events, except for the Chamber of Commerce donkey baseball, the infrequent visits of big bands such as Blue Baron, Horace Heidt, Jan Garber, and Golden Spike Days, which featured mandatory growth of facial hair for men, or a dunk in the horse tank on Main Street. To twist a well-known sentiment, McCook was a nice town to live in, but you wouldn't want to visit there. So the town inhabitants needed a focal point, such as a baseball team, to rally around. On the day of the home games, stand-up signs at downtown intersections read, "Baseball tonight." And to nearly everyone, this was the only game in town. Special incentives for the players. That's Max Quick. Okay, I want to show you. We made a trip 2 years ago, Mona and my wife and my daughter, and we went out there to travel through the old towns that I played in. I called it the Return to NILville. I'm standing there at the train station, which no longer had the Burlington train coming through. It was the Amtrak station, and the train only came about once a day or a week. It didn't come through very often. This building over here says Pat's Bootery. Now, Pat was one of the people on the baseball board, and he also had a sign on the outfield fence which said, "Hit me and win a pair of shoes, free pair of shoes." And I'll get into that later. Down here, it's very poor lighting, but I'm standing here with Bonna, and it's right where our dugout used to be, in East Side Ballpark. It now is called Felling Ballpark, and it's a Little League baseball park. They moved the fence in. The fence looks like the same old fence with all of the different signs on it, but it's moved in closer for younger boys. A lot of things are gone out there. Very few parks are still standing. Kearney is the same way it was. Kearney is one of the few because it has cement seats, and it's a real amphitheater. It's one of the few still standing. There was something very warm and special about those towns. The fences with their individual personalities. A home run was not just hit over the 375-foot marker or the 350-foot marker. It was hit over the Patrick's Shoe Store sign or the knee-high sign. One time I hit a drive out in right center, and I started to take off for first, and as I rounded, I heard the ball hit the fence, and I pulled up for a double, and when I came in, all of the guys in the dugout said, "Hobe, you hit the Patrick's Shoe Store sign. You got a free pair of shoes." So I said, "Are you sure?" And they said, "Yeah." So next morning I went down to the shoe store, and Pat Patrick was a very smiling guy. But when I told him what I was there for, my business, he suddenly dropped his smile and became very businesslike. And as I began looking over the shoes, he sort of steered me to the casual shoes, away from the wingtip brogans and all the expensive executive shoes. And I wound up buying, I think, a $17 pair of shoes and make him happy. But it was funny to see a change of expression. In early June, the setting of the summer sun assured at least a slight drop in temperature throughout McCook. On that night of the first home game in 1948, an excited hush cloaked the small NIL town. Those signs at main downtown intersections announced an event that would bring an overflowing crowd to Little East Side Ballpark. Baseball tonight. Nothing more was needed. Everyone in town knew what baseball and with whom. They all knew it was the night for Lexington and Lefty Haines, or Holdridge and Walt Ibsen, or Art Dollahan to drive into their town and try to wrest a victory from their battling cats. Deep into July and August, the setting sun no longer assured any measurable temperature change. Heavy warm air would hang over the town throughout the night. There was no air conditioning and no television in the modest southwestern Nebraska homes that year. McCook people sat on the porch swings and porch steps, waiting to catch the smallest breeze. Inside the houses, electric fans tried to circulate and cool the air enough to let folks get to sleep when it was time. Radios would be turned up and windows raised so those on the porch could listen to Jack Benny or Bob Hope and the Pepsodent Show. Later in the evening, dance music from Chicago could be captured with careful crackling tuning. Russ Morgan's or Blue Baron's big band faded across the Midwest airwaves. From a small record player over on West 4th Street, Kenny Sargent sang Under a Blanket of Blue with the Glenn Gray Orchestra, as Pearl Fagan and her daughter Burl, their work finished for the day, sat on the porch and fanned themselves with folded newspapers. In fact, the East Side Ballpark remained one of the coolest places in town. But on a mid-June evening in 1948, the heat was not on anyone's mind. The game was the thing. Excitement of this degree had not been felt around East Side for a long time. After finishing in last place in 1946 and 1947, the McCook fans had been promised a completely different outcome in 1948. With 3 new infielders from the Big 7 college champ, the University of Nebraska, an outstanding former AAA outfielder and ace pitcher secured from the 1947 NIL champs, the Hastings Sultans. That's Al McElraith, the player we got from Hastings. He's a tremendous left-handed hitter, and he played AAA ball. He played for Sacramento in California and also in the Southern Association. One of the hardest line drive hitters you'll ever see. Until 1948, most of the NIL teams were made up of local ball players or town ball players. But the character of the league changed radically. 2 new and predominant elements were added. Ex-professional ball players from every class up to and even from the majors, and veteran outstanding college players recruited from far outside the local territory. That's Eddie Miller, who played on McCook, played center field. Very fine hometown ball player. The older ex-professional ball players who drifted from town to town playing baseball for money and working at odd jobs became known as baseball bums. These by established senior citizens, a very small group who cared less about the improvement in local baseball than retaining the quiet and predictable character of their towns. The college hot dogs, so named by the baseball bums, who rented rooms and also worked at summer jobs, were treated with just a shade less suspicion than the baseball bums by those town integrity residents. Holdridge fans looked out on the diamond in 1949 and said, "Wait a minute, who are those guys? Tom Sutek, Bobby Lott, Jack Baxter, Rich Houghton, Len Hawkins. Where are Herschel Reinhardt, Al Beinhoff, Dale Meisenbach, or Marks, Hansen, and Landon?" They reached for their non-existent programs to see if they were at the right game. Rich Houghton had played third base for the Denver Bears in the Class A Western League the year before. Tom Sutek and Len Hawkins were outstanding and expensive semi-pros from Denver. And Bobby Lott and Jack Baxter were smooth fielding stars from the University of Denver. A lot of hometown players were suddenly riding the bench or even out of uniform in Holdridge. This was a great double play combination. They had Sutek to Lott to Baxter. And They had 33 double plays by the middle of August in 1949, and playing 2 times a week. That is phenomenal. I mean, they were really hot that year. So that's the sort of ball player that was coming in and changing the complexion of this league, which had before that been simply hometown boys. So successful in establishing parity was the far-reaching recruiting for the entire league that from 1948 to 1953, that's the period I played in, 5 different towns won the NIL's regular season title. In 1953, the race was so tight that even the 5th place team, Superior, with 15 wins and 15 losses, was at 500, and the winner only at 613. Kearney took first place with a 19-12 record after playing off an 18-12 tie with McCook. And Lexington and North Platte were forced to play off a 16-14 tie for 3rd and 4th. In just one startling year, McCook had set the league on an irreversible and escalating course of player spending, which alarmed those guarding the coffers and sent veteran sports writers into the streets waving their arms about the danger of the town's dwindling wealth as well as the future of NIL baseball. But the NIL townspeople didn't want to hear this. The ball players were riding high, attendance was way up, and excitement about the league had never been greater. We'll worry about it tomorrow, they all decided. If certain towns like Hastings couldn't afford to stay in anymore, let them drop out and quit criticizing the league. After all, the quality of baseball had never been so good. Some of those baseball bums and college hot dogs were somewhat colorful and unique. This is P.O. Karthauser, who played, was a catcher for McCook. And he would always put on a tantrum in a game someplace during the 9 innings. He would find a play that he could get very excited about, and the umpires were never quite sure if he was serious or not, but usually it was just an act, and the Holdridge fans loved to get on him. In fact, they had one night they called Boo P.O. Karthauser Night. Matt Sepik, second baseman brought in from the 3I League, Waterloo, to play for Superior, was both a piece of work and a work in progress when he played. In fact, if you'd have caught his act one particularly cold night, you might have thought his yarn was wound a little too loosely. Wearing some strange blanket garment to protest playing in the cold weather, he went to bat and lifted a home run over the right field fence. He raced around the bases at full speed, the weird garment fluttering all the way like a ripped sail, and slid into home with all the finesse of a big kite crashing in the mud. Matt then jumped to his feet, flapping like an early flying contraption, in violent protest with the home plate umpire, who was more than confused since he had made no call, the ball having cleared the fence in obvious fair territory, eliminating any possible play at home. After winning the argument, Sepik ran to the next hitter, insisting that he too wear the garment for good luck, and wrestled him to the ground when he objected. Matt was really in control of everything he did, but he was the only one that knew it. Much like P.O. Karthauser of McCook, knowing how to get the fans into the ball game, he was willing to fire all his dramatic forces into the fray for the good of the cause. To know Matt was to stand back and let him perform. Behind those moments of lunacy was a very competitive, talented, and blue-collar baseball player of the old school. In the one game in Superior, though Ed Van Nordheim seemed to have very good stuff, he couldn't get any of it by that great lineup in Superior of Connie Creedon, Tommy Hurd, Stickney, Sepik, Heim, and Wonka. Everything Ed delivered came back a double, a triple, or a run-scoring single. He stood there and watched the ball streak toward the fence between outfielders and now and then sail over it. He shook his head in bewilderment as the runners crossed the plate. In about the 7th inning, one of the Knights smashed a drive over the head of Eddie Miller in center field. Miller chased the ball down and relayed to Grogan, whose perfect throw to home caught the sliding runner for the 3rd out. Completely exhausted and discouraged, Van Nordheim still had a smile on him as he trudged to the dugout. "I've finally found a way to get them out of there," he said, throwing his glove down in the corner of the dugout. "I'll pitch to their power and we'll cut them off at home." Tommy O'Connor, a new catcher imported from Canada for North Platte, was a very good left-handed hitter and he had a great arm. This, incidentally, is Horace Garner. I'll get to him in a minute. Seems to be a little out of sequence or something. One slide seemed to have missed there. That's all right. Tommy O'Connor was good-looking, persuasive, engaging, a perfect salesman. One memorable night, he did a great selling job in calling balls and strikes for the umpire. Some catchers have a way of coming up out of the crouch and yelling, "Yeah," or "strike" as they catch the pitch and firing it down to third for the around-the-horn strikeout celebration. Many times this works and the umpire looks at his indicator and rings up strike 3. O'Connor was doing a masterful job in this role that night, and the McCook dugout was smoldering at the cagey receiver's apparent control of the plate umpire. P.O. Karthauser became very upset and began yelling critical and insulting things at the umpire. The rest of our bench joined P.O. in suggesting that the umpire get control of the game again. Ed Van Nordheim, who was pitching that game, topped everything when he shouted to O'Connor as the catcher faked a throw down to first to pick off a runner. "Don't throw that ball down there, catch," Ed warned. "You might lose your indicator." Toward the end of the season, 1949 season, McCook signed 2 Kansas City Monarchs as the team passed through on a barnstorming tour. Horace Garner, one of the players, a 6'4" speedy power hitter with an incredible arm, was coaxed into a pre-game demonstration one night. This is Horace. He stood at home plate and threw the ball all the way in the air to the 410-foot marker on the center field wall. NIL fans were convinced they had just seen the strongest arm ever to play in their league. Horace was a straightaway hitter and terrorized opposing pitchers with his echoing line drives through the middle. One night at Holdridge, he hit a low fastball which caused the pitcher to not only duck but fall down as it continued on its way like a Sam Snead one-iron shot over the center field fence. It was the fastest ball I ever saw to leave a park. Bobby West, McCook right fielder from Denver, was a very tough out. One playoff game at Holdridge, he began fouling off a number of pitches from Ralph Germano. Soon the count reached a dozen, then 13, 14, and about the 15th, the completely exasperated Germano reached down, grabbed up the rosin bag, and fired it with everything he had left. Bobby waited as the knuckle bag flopped its way up over the plate and swung. He missed, swinging so hard he fell down and sent the crowd into a wave of tension-releasing laughter. In 1952, Kearney had a big right-handed pitcher named Chuck Eisenman. It's Chuck right there. The fact that Chuck was one of the hardest to hit in the league was almost overlooked because of his huge, ever-present German Shepherd dog, which you see there in the center, on the front row, who often upstaged him. One night, Chuck told the dog to bring him his jacket after he had worked out a walk. The dog picked up the jacket with his mouth and trotted out to first base with it. Umpire Ed Manley threw up his arms, called time, and rushed out to inform Chuck that he should get that dog off the playing field and fast. This upset Chuck, who was very used to basking in the limelight with his huge pet. Manley wound up throwing both Chuck and his dog out of the game, which wouldn't have been noteworthy except that Life magazine had sent a camera crew to do a story on Chuck and his dog. Eventually, things were worked out, and the picture story appeared, if not exactly true to the intended script. We're losing some slides here. Okay. Seated at the Superior Hotel piano one night before the game was a huge man with a graying crew cut and a cigar stub in his mouth, his 240 pounds bunched in the comfortable upright position of a pianist who knew what he was doing. That's Lefty Hays, by the way. We'll get to him in a minute. His strong hands and forearms hovered over the keyboard. Huge fingers found notes with a majestic ease, delivering chords and melodies with a beauty and sensitivity that completely contradicted his blunt appearance. "Who is that?" I whispered to Eddie Miller. "That's Superior's new right fielder, Connie Creedon," Eddie said. At first glance, I thought Creedon was some club bouncer or a maintenance worker who had stopped in to play for a few bars of heart and soul or chopsticks. But within seconds, I realized we were in the presence of a very gifted and trained musician. He could play everything: classics, jazz, blues, boogie-woogie, church hymns, pop songs, opera, and ragtime, and play it without mistakes, with soul and skill, with rhythm and touch, and all without any sheet music. "Give me a light, Danny," Creedon said to the McCook manager, Danny Ferris, who 2 years before had managed Superior, and also knew Connie from earlier baseball times together in the Southern Association and the Providence League in Canada. Ferris jumped out of his chair at this request. "Sure, I'll give you a light," he said. "I'll light that cigar all day just to keep you playing here." He looked at our team, which by now had formed a sizable audience. "Ain't he terrific?" Danny exclaimed, sounding like Creedon's agent. There was no doubt about it. He was terrific. "Play Stardust," Danny said. Creedon shifted some levers and stops on the adjacent electric organ and played it only as Hoagie Carmichael would have wanted it played. "Ain't he terrific?" Ferris said again, very proud of his old baseball friend. I went over to ask Ferris about this newfound genius who destroyed all preconceived physical conceptions of an accomplished pianist. Creedon sat there looking like a 2:45 honky-tonk piano player. All the scene lacked was some empty beer mugs and cigar burns on the piano. "He's an automobile salesman down here," Dan said, "and he sells cars just like he plays that thing." In that case, I thought, must be making some dealer a fortune. Creedon began to play some boogie-woogie with a walking bass and a great right hand. The old Karthauser got up and started jitterbugging like a World War II canteen champion. "Ain't he terrific?" Ferris said. Half an hour later, Connie was about ready to quit, and it was time to suit up for the game. "Before you go," Gene Dellenbaugh requested, "would you play Ave Maria?" Creedon played it as beautifully as I have ever heard it. Then he got up and left with Danny Ferris at his side, Danny's arm proudly around his amazing and unpublicized friend's shoulder. We all just sat there quietly for a few moments. We needed a little more time before going off to baseball. Now, here we go with Lefty. For a long time, since about 1936 or before, all Elmer Lefty Hays had to do was toss his glove out on the mound and local sports reporters would begin writing of another Lexington victory. It didn't matter who the team was, the legend tells, Lefty could beat them. The book on Lefty was that he had just too much country in him to leave the farm and was too shy for the city life of pro ball. No one will ever know whether he could have pitched in the majors. They do know he beat just about everybody around western Nebraska for a couple of decades. Lefty always pitched at home, and I don't think it was just because of the lights, although I once remember momentarily losing a ground ball deep in the hole between first and second on a muddy night at Lexington. It was more that if Lexington fans had come to the game and found someone else on the mound, they might have been confused and gone home, thinking they were in the wrong ballpark. About Lefty's signing with the Major League Club, Bill Denker said, I do remember hearing somewhere that he once drove to Oklahoma City to sign with someone, but when he got to the hotel, he decided to turn around and go home. Lefty was a shy guy, a loner. We both thought about Lefty and his quiet, private behavior. You know, I continued, I always had trouble hitting him, but one day, the year he pitched for Kearney, I drilled his curveball hard to left field. When I came up to bat the next time, he knocked me down with the first pitch. And I mean, it was close. Lefty, Bill laughed. The pitch must have got away from him. I never saw him throw at anyone. But I remembered that after the knockdown pitch, Lefty had put his hands on his hips and made a face as if to say, "How do you like that, wise guy?" He had a funny way of showing it if he was such a nice guy. Then I remember telling the first baseman after the line drive that it was my first solid hit I'd had off Lefty in about 2 years. Since I was smiling when I said it, Lefty might have seen it and thought I was gloating. Or possibly the first baseman had said something to Lefty in the dugout, that I didn't think much of his curve, or even worse. That's Bill Dinker. Bill played with me at Nebraska here. He was a wonderful third baseman, hard hitting. Played at Lexington with Lefty Hays. And I also played 1 year at North Platte when I was there. That's Walt Ibsen, yeah. Over at Holdridge, another NIL legend continued to pitch. Forever, it seemed. After 2 decades of dominating opposition hitters, Unca Walt Ibsen, they called him Unca, showed astonishing longevity by striking out 16 Lexington batters in a 2-0 shutout win in 1949. Walt was then at least 40 years old. The NIL teams traveled by car to all away games. Players were not required to take their own cars, but could do so if they found riding with the designated drivers too terrifying. The basic requirements for designated drivers seem to be a big, powerful car and a heavy foot on the accelerator. Frightening as it was at times, having someone else do the driving after a long, hot night ball game was usually worth the trade-off. Midway through one of the trips, Doc Dennis, one of the regular designated drivers, suddenly pulled his big Buick onto the shoulder. "Give me a beer, Mildred," he said to his wife. "I'm having another one of my sinking spells." Sinking spells, I thought. Yes, by all means have a beer if you are having sinking spells. He even considered changing drivers. "I'm sure we have some volunteers back here." But Doc drank the beer and roared on down the road as we slumped just a little deeper into the back seat and covered our eyes. Reading Burma shave signs with their clever verses and looking for white horses, a guaranteed base hit that night, were 2 traditional, though not very challenging, ways of passing the time on the road. Apparently, there was some difficulty assembling all of the regular designated drivers before one road trip to North Platte, because Grogan and I found ourselves assigned to a maroon 1947 Ford sedan and a new driver. Neither of us knew this polite, quiet man of about 40, and I can't remember his name, but I was pleased and relieved that he drove with less speed and reckless abandon than some of the regulars did. Our trip to and from North Platte, though clogged with the usual billowing gravel dust, was quiet and relaxed, and Grogan seemed more reassured that we would reach our destination in one piece. Excuse me. After we returned home, Eddie Miller, who had ridden in another car, met us with his friendly grin, this time accompanied with a sparkle in his eye. "How did the trip go, Bob?" Eddie asked Grogan, well aware of Bob's fear of flying on roads. "Okay, I guess. Why?" Bob said. "Oh, I just wondered," Eddie said. "Did that little Ford go too fast for you?" "No, we had a nice, relaxed trip. Not too fast for a change," Bob replied. "So you like the new driver?" "Well, yeah, he didn't say much at all. I was able to catch a little sleep instead of hiding on the floor. Why all the questions?" "Oh, no reason," Eddie said. "I agree, for a guy with an artificial right leg, he drives pretty good, doesn't he?" Grogan stared at Miller but said nothing. What Eddie had said was found to be true, and I was glad he waited till after the game to tell Bob. I don't think Spider would have had his 3 for 4 at the plate if he had known about it before the game. After winning the NIL championship and playoffs in 1948, all right, those are Superior fans. We'll get to them later. This is the Superior Park. And they didn't have a dugout. They had a bench right next to the railing. The fence was there. And these fans would get so close to us, they right in our ear, you know. They're practically on our bench, and they were very, very annoying. After winning the NIL championship and playoffs in 1948, in McCook, we were treated like the amazing Mets of 1969, New York fame. And had there been any tall buildings in town, I'm sure we would have had a ticker tape parade. We did have a big celebration at the Elks Club south of town, where we were toasted and feted all evening. After all, we 3 college hot dogs from Nebraska U and its 1948 Big 7 championship fame had extended the winning formula right on through the summer and helped take a 2-year last place team from the outhouse to the penthouse in one head-spinning season. Signing pitcher Big Eddie McCarthy and slugging outfielder Al McElrath away from Hastings, the NIL champ of 1947, was also not a bad move for the Cats. The 1948 NIL playoffs caused so much excitement that the bleachers in Old East Side Ballpark in McCook could not begin to hold all the folks interested in seeing the games. The giddy town baseball merchants separated themselves from good sense by allowing the fans to flock inside the playing field and settle against the outfield fence with the complete understanding that they would remain neutral when the ball was hit to the fence among them. So intoxicated were the McCook baseball planners with the prospects of sudden financial increase from the Shaughnessy playoffs that they were barely able to conceal their panic when it appeared we would sweep the first round and thus cancel 2 more possible nights of overflowing gate receipts. A few of us, competitive purists that we were had great series and expecting joyous praise from our employers. We were puzzled by their wide-eyed, restrained reception, being unable to convey to us that letting up a little so as to enjoy the team's full financial potential would not actually cause the management unhappiness was almost more than the baseball merchants could bear. Nevertheless, McCook baseball fathers, delighted with the amazing success of their hard community efforts, began drawing up plans to move the Cats games to a larger park in 1949 so that they would be able to accommodate the flock of fans that were coming out to see this new thing called winning. Unfortunately, whereas the Little East Side Diamond was in very fine condition, the new larger park named Fairgrounds Ballpark, because it was where they had formerly held an annual rodeo and fair, was not. We sometimes thought the infield had not been dragged since the last Brahma bull riding contest. The 5-player overhaul of the McCook Cats represented the kind of single-minded town purpose which would soon hit every town in the league, and the shockwaves would shake the financial foundations of them all. From some sports writers came angry cries of foul and gloom and doom and destruction for the NIL. Not surprisingly, most of the criticism came from the town struggling to keep up in this new fast-lane baseball league. So intense did the competition and financial anxiety become in 1949 as the playoff selections were being decided that angry arguments and even fistfights erupted in a few of the hot evening battles, creating tenseness and ugly moods among the towns and resulting in protests being filed and suspensions handed out. This was the season when Floyd Stickney, league president and also third baseman for Kearney, suspended North Platte's ace catcher, Bob Paulson, for losing control and knocking out umpire Ed Manley. Then, the embarrassed Stickney had to level the same penalty on himself a few weeks later when he couldn't keep his own emotions in check and punched out Grand Island shortstop Jerry Koch during a hot argument over a play at home plate. I experienced the NIL combat emotions personally when I was knocked down several times by Art Dollahan. That's Art. Art Dollahan's angry fastballs after I'd hit 2 consecutive and uncharacteristic home runs in one game during the 1949 pennant race. I know I heard one of the knockdown pitches hit the bill of my cap as I flew out from under it. Things became very tense over the prospect of losing out on the playoff money. In 1951, I was playing second base for the North Platte Plainsmen. And though this town of 14,000 was considerably larger than McCook, on that chilly, wet day it seemed even more remote and lifeless. Waiting in the barber shop, reading some back issues of the North Platte Telegraph Bulletin, I had caught an article about myself. Hobe Hays, the news item read, former Cat infielder and more recently of Chicago University, they really meant the Art Institute, is expected to arrive in North Platte soon enough to be in the lineup at second base. He'll have to do some fancy hitting too if he is to hold to the pace of his predecessor, Doug Duffy, who left for summer school in Colorado. Duffy had hit 13 for 29 to bat .448. Now that's what I call making a newcomer feel relaxed and right at home, I thought. I felt alone because I was starting over again. It was my fourth year in the NIL, and I was aware that though this was a new beginning, it brought none of the thrill and anticipation of my first year at McCook in 1948. It was simply a new location for doing a job called baseball. That's Freddie Wells. Fred pitched for us at North Platte. He was, the year before, one of the key pitchers for the Lincoln Athletics here in Class A ball. He was very good, had a great curveball. I didn't even know most of the players here. The recruitment turnover had been so rapid. I didn't have a day job yet either, and my options in Buffalo Bill Cody's town did little to lift my spirits. It's George Levitt's shortstop. George also played for the Lincoln A's. He was shortstop in, I think, 48, right alongside Nellie Fox. And so we had some pretty good ball players out there in North Platte. The rain began coming down harder. It would rain for most of the month of June, and at times we thought we would never get a game in before the summer was over. Hank Williams was now singing No Letter Today, so I ordered a chicken fried steak to try and pick things up a little. This would be a hard year for the NIL, a real test of survival, because gate receipts were being washed away, but expensive players still had to be paid. The best thing about 1951 was that if we could ever get a dry day, we believed North Platte could field one of the most powerful teams the league had yet seen. That's Kermit Lewis. Kermit Lewis was playing that year at North Platte for us. He played AAA ball in San Francisco. He played for Holdridge, he played for Superior. He managed and played at Superior, and when I went to North Platte, he was playing first base for us. Great first baseman, tremendous power hitter. In 1952, the rumblings of NIL, fiscal indigestion, barely audible during 1948, were so loud that everyone in the league had to pay attention. Following that first year when McCook began to gobble up outside players, the NIL took a financial roller coaster ride that would upset the stomachs of many writers, creating an unhealthy degree of anxiety and animosity that threatened the league's success and even its continued existence. The popular image of the semi-pro ball player was that of someone who played for money, yes, but not much money. He needed a day job too, whereas the professional, signed by a major or minor league team, played for enough money to make a living from just baseball. In 1946, in the NIL, this was reasonably accurate. McCook's players, for example, nearly all of whom were local town athletes, received a mere $2.50 to $3 a game. By 1955, just 9 years later, salaries had soared to as high as $750 per month for pitchers, and other players averaged $350 a month. By 1953, the baseball bum specter, which I had once regarded with humor and pity, was now uncomfortably near. I could hear its labored breathing behind me. I envisioned myself years in the future, standing around the showroom at Hinman's Motors in North Platte, and watching Bob Harris, now wearing a hearing aid, hobble over to goose cackling Seth Negley with his cane, and Seth nearly jumping out of his walker. And I saw myself sitting with a cup of black coffee and noticeably thinning hair in the small cafe talking to some red-faced rookie about the women I never found in North Platte or McCook, while Hank Williams' backwoods tones informed us of no letter today, and Eddie Arnold again notified me that he was born to lose. What was the baseball bum story? What was the source of that denigrating label stuck on many of my older associates? Was this leering, grizzled specter ready to take me to the land of bumdom with a sore arm and tired knees? Lurking as part of my possible future, it had forced me to make some life choices sooner than I had expected. The profile of this creature began usually with a boy signing a major league contract shortly after or before high school graduation, being sent to Class D ball, working his way up the system until it was determined he had reached his peak, and then being cut and sent out into the world to support himself, like an ex-con paroled from prison. Such a lad, now a diamond weary veteran, having never gone to college or even technical school, drifted from place to place doing what he had been trained to do, playing baseball. When his body broke down, or the small-town baseball teams that would still hire him went bankrupt, he sat on a bench in front of the hotel and tried to figure out where he could work. Obviously, his choices were limited. Small wonder then that when word got around of the kind of money that was being shoveled out to the NIL players during that 1948 to 1955 span, many pro ball players who were tiring of minor league grind and suspected they would never reach the majors decided to jump ship and get in on the good semi-pro money while they still had the good baseball tools. As for me, having been an art major at Nebraska, I wasn't sure where I could find financially and aesthetically satisfying employment. After a year at the Chicago Art Institute and my first summer with North Platte, I faced that problem. My rose-colored rookie glasses had been broken by the hard realities of small-town baseball economics. Gone was the excited, naive 22-year-old who, as an avid reader of William Saroyan, viewed the town of McCook from a writer's distance, expecting Saroyan-like romances and magical chance contacts to take place between lonely special people in the warm summer days as the lone meadowlark sang near the railroad tracks. I was glad I had replaced those rose-colored glasses with shatterproof reality glasses, ground for the real world of baseball and life. They allowed me to see how to move on at the right time. Without this clear, soul-searching vision, I might have drifted on in a Danny Ferris-style journey fraught with anxiety, my best years discarded without significant memories. As it happened, my life took some unexpected and interesting turns away from the static and unproductive road it seemed to be following. At the end of the 1953 season, I decided not to return to the NIL the following summer. I thought about the baseball bums I had known and wondered what they would all do after 1955. The Cornhusker League had been disbanded in 1953, and the Pioneer Night League had shrunk to a 4-team competition in 1955. With the NIL just suddenly gone, what would happen to all the good ball players who had made Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday nights magical for those solid citizens hungry for quality baseball, out there in the rural semi-pro baseball capital of the Midwest? Television was making its way into a substantial number of homes as the NIL went under. The World Series was being broadcast, and soon many major and minor league games would be in the living rooms of all those McCook, North Platte, and other semi-pro enthusiasts. The baseball fans' world was changing more rapidly than they could have imagined. It was the passing of a truly unique and important time in rural America sports history. Almost half a century later, I still look back on those times with pride and fondness. I forget about the hours of boredom and loneliness. I discount the tense underlying feuds between certain towns and players as the costs got out of hand. Feuds that took the boy out of baseball and put the hired gun into it. Instead, I can get goosebumps remembering that incredible first-year roar after I relayed a ball from Bob Grogan to make a double play that killed a Holdridge rally in the late innings of a 1948 playoff game. More than 3,500 fans were squeezed into the 1,500-seat East Side ballpark, hundreds sitting along the third and first base lines and inside the fence behind the surprised outfielders. My slow-motion trot to the dugout after that relay to first was a dreamlike, out-of-body experience, the like of which I have never felt at any other time. With each step, the volume of the crowd roar seemed to change, as if someone had a hand on the volume control and were turning it up and down in cadence with my stride. I cannot imagine any Class D Rookie League game generating such an explosive release of stifled town pride, relief, and collective sports joy, and a sound that must have been heard all the way to Holdridge. It was as close as I have ever felt to being swept up and carried on the shoulders of sound waves in a numbing, surreal moment of pure sports triumph.